and it's always wonderful to be back at UVA. My favorite title these days is UVA Dad. We have a couple of experts here to break down the issue of U.S. commitments, reduce or rethink. We've got Alexander Bick, who's Associate Professor of Practice and Public Policy, the UVA Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy, a visiting fellow with the Hoover Institution, senior fellow of the Miller Center. Very impressive. And Stephen Wertheim, who is senior fellow, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome to both of you. And our discussant, Mara Rudman, former Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, former Deputy Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, senior fellow, Miller Center. So we are going to have a spirited discussion, and we've got our experts surrounding the table. And so let's get it started. Stephen, your 30,000-foot view of the issue before us today. Why don't you get us started, and we can go from there.
Well, thank you very much. It's a treat to be here. I'm an aspiring UVA dad, but that'll be a while. And great to be in conversation with all of you. So I thought I wouldn't summarize my memo, but maybe lay out a couple problems that I think will be the priority problems that U.S. foreign policy will need to address in 2028-29. First of all, there is a legitimation crisis in U.S. foreign policy in our country. There is a widespread sense that U.S. foreign policy lacks a purpose, that it costs too much, and gains too little. My read is that the next president will face a kind of back-to-basics moment that will demand a focus on the essentials that America needs in global engagement, not on everything it might want. The public, the political system, has given President Trump extraordinary latitude to experiment with policy and profess all kinds of impulses, and I understand that only in the context of exhaustion with the kind of sanctimony associated with a foreign policy that seemed to fail on its own terms and to be divorced from the public. So the second problem related to that, I think, is America's military overcommitment since the end of the Cold War. For my money, this is the fundamental reason why the United States is having to reassess its global interests today. Because for decades, the United States took on far-flung defense obligations that the country at that time had no serious intention of fulfilling if they ever came due, because we assumed they weren't going to come due or that was going to be some other generation's problem. Well, it's our problem. Trump, to me, is a morbid symptom of that problem, but not its cause. But after Trump, it will also be more feasible to reduce America's defense burden. More feasible internationally because some allies and partners are hedging and diversifying their international partnerships. More feasible domestically too, because I think President Trump has shown some demand for this kind of approach, but also not delivered and ceded the lane of realism, less war, more limited military engagement and spending. And finally, I would just say, we have to have a foreign policy that works to address the crisis of governance in the United States. It has damaged American democracy when political leaders have waged or sustained wars abroad, wars that often were not successful, while Americans face unmet needs at home: housing, education, healthcare, and needs that their political system cannot even begin to address, or so it seems, while suddenly something happens far across the world and both parties snap to attention and are ready to shovel whatever kind of money it takes. So I think the next president, it's crucial. Foreign policy is not going to solve the problems with American governance, but it's crucial that it not make it worse. So the next president can't fall into that trap. I think the Biden administration fell into that trap. President Trump falling into.
Alex.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So many friends and colleagues in the audience, and have the opportunity, obviously, to share the subject review. Maybe I can start in a slightly more philosophical place on this. We're asked to talk about commitments in this panel, and I think commitments really is code for grand strategy. What should America's grand strategy be in the years ahead, recognizing that the strategies that we've pursued up to this point at least no longer appear to meet the moment. And I think as people contemplate strategy, they often talk about making ends and means meet one another. In other words, you define your objectives and you define the means that you think are sufficient to meet those objectives. I don't disagree with that. I think that's exactly right, and I think that's a part of what Stephen has just laid out, a gap between means and ends. But there's another really important part of a strategy, and if you look in the national security establishment, it's called the strategic landscape. If you look in a corporate boardroom, it's called a market analysis or a competitor analysis, and that's the piece of the strategy where you lay out what is the world in which we are identifying our objectives, what is the world in which we are identifying the means that can meet them. And to my eye, that part has become much, much more complicated. I think, in a sense, that we are living in an age of uncertainty which is truly profound. And what I mean by that is, I think you could look across time and come to the conclusion that, in a way, foreign policy is always about the management of uncertainty. That's hardly a new thing. It's a perennial problem in foreign policy. But there are moments where uncertainty is greater than it is at other moments. And I picked up John Kenneth Galbraith's book from the early 19th, where he analyzes the early 1970s, and it was subsequently a BBC program, where he was looking at the disruptions of the early 1970s and saying, in a sense, these have challenged all of the assumptions that have animated economic and particularly economic policy in a way that forces us to really rethink what's going on. And I think we're in a similar moment now, and I can go through a series of them. Maybe we'll come to them over the course of the conversation. But I think as we imagine what the world order will look like in 10 years, there are very different possibilities, one of which is the United States could try to transform itself essentially into an autarky, to become insulated from a world which is in disorder. You can imagine a condominium among great powers. You can imagine a new bipolar world. You can imagine a purely disordered world. There are many different permutations. But I think geopolitically, we really are deeply uncertain what the architecture of the international system will be in the future. And that generates uncertainty not only for us, it also is uncertainty that other states around the world seek to take advantage of, to test their own strength, to see what ability they have to dictate outcomes at the regional level and potentially at the international. So that's on the side of geopolitics. I think also in technology, and this is something that all of us, I think, are becoming more and more aware of, the AI revolution, if you believe its practitioners, is the most important transformation of the way that we will fight, work, live, think, socialize, perhaps certainly in a generation, and perhaps in much longer than that. If this is truly a general purpose technology like the steam engine, like electrification in the 20th century, it will have profound implications across a whole range of different elements of our lives. The strategic choices that you make about artificial intelligence, the role of the government in regulating artificial intelligence, our competition with China about artificial intelligence, break down on a whole series of assumptions about the frontier, assumptions about dissemination, assumptions about whether states will be able to rapidly catch up if one state makes immediate advances. Again, it's enormous uncertainty about what the nature of the change will be and uncertainty about how it will affect the balance of. The reason I say all this is I think fundamentally, actually, the challenge that we face is not to imagine a grand strategy in an idealized way. I think the challenge we face is to manage profound uncertainty in a way that's responsible, allows us to consolidate advantages that we have, and that keeps us nimble across a range of potential future. I think that's very difficult to do, but I think philosophically that's the place that we need to start.
So President Trump has clearly vented his frustration with NATO, with the United Nations. I'm not asking anybody to make a partisan statement, but I'm curious, as our experts, whether you think that NATO is a post-Cold War relic. Does the United Nations still have relevance in our world, or are those potentially things the next president may reduce or rethink?
So I think, these are the fundamental questions. I think, maybe I'll take them in sequence. Look, the United Nations, there was a speaker here just earlier this week who made a very compelling point, which is the United Nations was a system created now almost a century ago to manage a war which is now a distant memory for many of the people living today. And that's not to say that it didn't bring enormous benefits over that time. It absolutely did. I still think there are very important things the United Nations can do. But you have to face reality, which is the UN is no longer a major force in almost any of the conflicts that are taking place around the world today. At the same time, you have states which are pushing, I think rightly, for greater influence in that institution or for greater influence over the overall shape of collective action. So I think that's an institution which does need to be rethought. That doesn't mean you necessarily wipe the slate clean, but it does mean I think we have to be much more creative about the kinds of institutions that will solve collective problems if the ones that we have aren't able to do that. And I would say effectively, I think NATO is so strongly in the U.S. interest that I would be very hesitant to jettison it, but we're already seeing states beginning to form other kinds of collaborative mechanisms which may be able to act in places where NATO is no longer as unified as it has been in the
Reduce or rethink, United Nations, NATO, your thoughts?
I agree with what Alex said about UN and the challenges that it will face going forward. I think the question for the United States is, we've valued the United Nations for many decades as a kind of adjunct or a vehicle for American power, for American preferences. So now we're seeing that it's not so useful for that purpose. The world is more contested. If we come to a different sense of our place in the world, with the recognition that China, for example, isn't going anywhere, we could find new uses for vehicles like the UN, but we'll have to reimagine our own role and our own relationship to those institutions rather than berate them for failing to do things that they're never going to do and weren't designed to do in the first place. Now, with respect to NATO, I actually think, ironically, NATO now has a clearer purpose than it has in many decades. NATO lost its clear purpose after the end of the Cold War. It then became a vehicle to allow the United States to be the preeminent actor in European security, to project power into the Middle East, the greater Middle East. And the phrase at the time in the 90s was NATO has to go out of area or go out of business. But NATO is supposed to be a defensive alliance to protect its members against external attack. Well, now, NATO members, due in part to the vast enlargement of NATO in the post-Cold War period, do face a serious conventional military threat from Russia, at least those members that are close to Russia. And so that gives NATO a very clear purpose to focus on. The problem is that the United States' interest in being the leading provider of security through NATO is not so clear because Russia does not have the scale of power that the Soviet Union did that would enable it to overrun the European continent. Europeans collectively and individually have a greater interest in doing that, and increasingly they have the capability. So in my view, the United States should remain within NATO, but it should move to more of a supporting role over time as Europe gains capabilities to be able to act on its own if needed.
Does that mean we're no longer leader of the free world?
If you want to say that, okay. At this point, I'm not sure what the construct of the free world means. I see, profound battles between different conceptions of freedom or unfreedom running through the United States, running through other members of the so-called free world. So I actually don't think it's that helpful to divide the world into this neat kind of Cold War-esque map of here's a block of freedom and here's a block of unfreedom.
Would you like to respond, Alex, your thoughts?
Yeah, I share many of the same views that have just been expressed. I think I would differ on the free world question, and I'm not a hard ideologue on this. I agree, and in the Biden administration was on the side that pushed actually to be a little bit more subtle in some of the messaging, making clean divisions because the world isn't clean, and there are many partners around the world that we need to work with who are not democracies. That's a reality of hard power politics. So for very pragmatic reasons, I've not fallen into the camp which argues that you should have a neat division. On the other hand, I think there's a core challenge And I would go back to your point about NATO and NATO sort of out of area. NATO was not created as an institution to project. It was created as a defensive alliance. It was created as an institution which would help bring stability into Europe so that the United States did not have to fight another war in the Europe. And underneath that, as I think many people will know, was an understanding that the Europeans were not able collectively to cooperate at a sufficient level to ensure their own security. That rivalries between France and Germany and other states in Europe would undermine their ability essentially to preserve security on the continent, and that would then call us once again back to the European theater as we've been called in World War I and then again in the Second. And so the role of leadership is partially one of ideological, articulating an ideology that others will want to follow behind. It's partially about helping to corral states in such a way that their security and our security is ensured at the same time. On the ideological component, I also think, and this is a bit difficult given already what I've laid out, but the formation of an international order is not something which takes place purely based on strategic calculation and institutions and the balance of power. It also requires animating ideas. And I think one of the great struggles right now is to determine what the animating ideas will be for the next iteration of an order that serves American interests and serves those of our allies and partners around the world, one that provides a basis for security, that provides a basis for collective prosperity. And I think to try to rob that content would be a mistake, because I think there are a lot of people around the world, not just among our Asian allies, but broadly across every continent in the world, who still see elements of the free world as the kinds of societies that they aspire to live in. They're not, I think, necessarily enamored with what they're seeing in the United States right now, but you have to think what the alternatives are. And I think it remains our responsibility to put forward the best vision of that we can and to bring others.
24 years ago, as a young correspondent in the aftermath of 9/11, I was sent to Afghanistan, where I encountered all kinds of NATO forces. The Turks were eager to take me up in a helicopter to show me all the cool things they were doing to support the United States. The Greeks invited me to their consulate to celebrate Easter with them. I got to see basically NATO's response to the United States being attacked. I realize a quarter century has gone by since then, but when tested, NATO responded, correct?
Yes.
You want to expound on that a little bit? I mean, you've not seen reason why NATO no longer on similar, right?
I think NATO should respond to a similar crisis, yes. I think that the question is whether the United States remains committed to that responsibility. Obviously, this administration has a very different view on that than I do.
I also believe that President Trump has pushed NATO allies to step up spending on defense. He believes clearly that some of the NATO allies kind of got a little lax, perhaps thinking that the United States was ready to step in at a moment's notice. Some people I've talked to suggested that if the United States ever gets tangled up with China over, say, Taiwan, that NATO allies need to be prepared to defend themselves against potentially a Putin invasion. Your thoughts on any of that you want to dig in on?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, even if we didn't have a president, now a two-term president, who was questioning NATO commitment constantly, it would still be the case, exactly as you say, that if the United States gets into a no-kidding conflict with China, we're simply not going to have the capacity to provide the kind of deterrent that we normally do in Europe. And so for that reason alone, Europeans should be stepping up. So I think that's been the right direction. The problem that I have with the way President Trump has pursued this, he's questioned the political commitment to NATO, but he isn't actually clearly effectuating a shifting of the defense burden from the United States onto European allies. Our force posture in Europe is, only very marginally changed from when Trump took office. also true under his first administration. It seems like what he wants is to retain the kind of control, the kind of leverage that the United States has enjoyed as the leading member of the alliance, and to do that in perpetuity, while just bearing less of the cost, so that Europeans pay more to do what the United States says it wants to do. Mm-hmm. I don't think that works. And I don't think that solves the strategic problem for the United States, which, as I say, is a problem of overcommitment and overstretch. So the United States needs to be working gradually, it's not going to happen overnight, to put itself in a position where, yes, if it didn't want to respond through direct military force to a Russian attack in Eastern Europe, it wouldn't necessarily need to, because Europeans would handle that themselves, whether that's because we as a country decide it's not in our interest to respond in that way, or because we have our hands full in other theaters.
You suggest security and prosperity should guide U.S. foreign policy. Would you dig into that a bit for us?
Sure. I mean, I don't think I have very different views about what, the fundamental interests of the United States are. I think the United States certainly needs to be able to defend itself, to prevent other powers from being able to encroach upon our vital interests. I would even say that, the concept of security is not just about physical security, territorial safety. It's also about safeguarding our constitutional order, the kind of liberties that are enshrined in the Constitution. And that gives rise to a debate, of course, among Americans who see those elements differently. Mm-hmm. And so naturally, we then have different definitions of what is the America to be secured, and therefore what does that mean for American foreign policy. That's part of what I think we're dealing with right now. And I think the United States foreign policy also needs to provide for the conditions of American prosperity. Those are I think the two foundational elements, but there's so much to, unpack right there that it's not simply a kind of objective question of what can keep the United States safe. If that's all we were about, man, do we have a great hand to play. We've got oceans, we've got weaker and friendly neighbors, if you will, a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere to keep out other rivals if they were to try to militarily encroach upon the hemisphere. If that's all American foreign policy wanted to do, that would be really easy. Oh, we've got nuclear deterrence to boot. So I think that's actually an important thing to keep in mind for perspective's sake. Because if we do more than that in the world, and we do, and I think that we should do more than that, then we want to make sure that we don't cause more problem for ourselves than the security that we could enjoy within the Western Hemisphere.
You argue this strategy for this transitional moment focus on 4 key areas. You lay that out.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can just respond to the
Absolutely.
point that was made, because I completely agree. I mean, I think, look, I can lay out a bad story about where we are right now, not just because it's uncertain, right? And you can go down the list from revisionism in Russia and China to the threats against the dollar as a reserve currency to I looked up the statistics for this recently. Arms sales reached $2.7 trillion in 2024. That in itself is fairly abstract. That was nearly 10% higher than the previous year and the largest jump since the Cold War. So we're in the midst of an arms race. We're in the midst of a moment where the two nuclear states is becoming 3 nuclear states. And there's also real proliferation risk elsewhere. And even within our body politic, a stat that really frightened me, there was a poll in October of last year where Americans were asked, do you see violence as a legitimate recourse to right the wrongs in our country? 30% of Americans answered that question in the affirmative. And it was interestingly almost even between the two parties. 31% of Republicans, 28% of Democrats. That's within the margin of error. So there is a militarization taking place. There is comfort or an acceptance of violence as a potential political solution. There are political and geopolitical realignments which to me make conflict more likely than they have been in the past. All of those things are profoundly bad for America. And whether you want to think about the parallels to 1914 or the parallels to the mid-1930s, or you're more hopeful and you think about the 1970s. In any case, this is a bad set of factors for America and America. On the other hand, everything you've just said is absolutely right. We maintain massive advantages in our military. Our military remains the dominant military in the world, and not by a small margin. Our economy remains the most dynamic in the world on the technology frontier. There's so many strengths that America brings to bear. And I think ultimately, while a lot of trust has been eroded with our allies, and our NATO allies in particular, but also our allies an enormous amount, it will be, in my view, impossible to restore that. I think that we've actually seen a full rupture in trust. But the reality, as I said before, is where else will people turn? The Europeans don't have another alternative. The Japanese don't have another alternative. And as a consequence, they remain committed to working with the United States because the United States is their best available partner. And I think that means actually that we're at a moment, as I said, of profound risk, but also a profound opportunity for the reasons that you've said. Trump has essentially taken the chessboard and thrown it up in the air. That has forced other states to think much more carefully about their own commitments and their own defense, their own security, their own economies, absent the certainty of the U.S. umbrella. And that's a huge opportunity for the next president, to go in and not to jettison our relationships, not to move towards autarky, not to say alliances are no longer in America's interest, but to renegotiate the terms of those alliances, and even to think whether the alliances may need to be supplemented with other kinds of multivariate relationships that will allow us to succeed. And just to give Ukraine as an example, I worked on Ukraine in the Biden administration. I have very different views from the views that President Trump arrived in the Oval Office with respect to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It's really quite impressive that now, 15, 18 months into the Trump administration, the Ukrainians last month took territory for the first time in not a lot. I'm not saying the war is going well, but Ukraine has essentially continued to defend its independence and its sovereignty. The president's efforts to play footsie with President Putin have not been successful. There is no alignment taking place between the United States and Russia. On the margins, there are policy choices that I don't support. But ultimately, we're not seeing a major realignment towards Russia. And European states are increasingly taking over the burden not only of funding the war, but also in realms of intelligence and political support. And so, we are watching a world which is moving in a direction which you could have heard President Obama make many statements that the Europeans needed to take a stronger role in securing their own defense and playing a bigger space. So I think this creates a tremendous opportunity. To answer your question, and then I'll stop. I think there are 3 or 4 things that are really fundamental. The first is I think we need to invest in our own areas of strength and in our own economy. And that means probably industrial policy on a scale that's even greater than the Biden administration tested, and that the Trump administration is itself pursuing in slightly different ways. But I think in order to invest, particularly in keeping us at the frontier in emerging technologies and beginning to have those technologies filter into the way that our economy functions in a much more fundamental way, advanced robotics, manufacturing. Secondly, I think we need to rebuild our partnerships with our allies on new terms. And I think this is going to be much more multivariate. It's going to require working together on issues like supply chains, issues like technology governance, issues related to defense production, where we have profound shared interests, where other states have very, very important things to contribute. This is not a one-sided relationship, and where these will be relationships not necessarily of equals in terms of power, but equals in terms of the negotiation going in as to what those arrangements should look like. Thirdly, I think we need to avoid catastrophic risk, and this comes back to the first point I made about uncertainty. I think we need to be careful about bets that are too big or moves that are too big, because I think there are real risks geopolitically and on technology, and that means I think we need to have a more robust dialogue with the Chinese than we have had on issues like AI safety, for example. That's an area, it's in our interest, I think it's in their interest. It's not something they want to talk to us about, to be clear. This is not, that they've just been waiting for us to come, but I think we need to find ways to incentivize that conversation more effectively. And the last one, which only echoes in poorer form what Stephen's already laid out, is I think we need a new domestic bargain on the basis for foreign policy. We need to find a way to be honest with the American people about the risks that we face, honest about the responsibilities that will entail, and to develop a narrative which, if not unifying, at least points to the aspirations of a broad segment of America that Americans can get behind. And I think a number of presidents, including President Trump at moments, have moved in that direction. President Biden certainly tried very hard to do that. It hasn't worked yet. I think a lot of effort needs.
Stephen, if President-elect 48 picks up the phone and calls you and says, I've read your stuff, I find it interesting, how do I implement some of your ideas? Some thoughts on that?
Sure. I think a lot of my ideas involve putting the United States responsibly in a position to be less burdened in the military. So I think, to take Europe, for example, we need to generate a plan in tandem with the Europeans about how the Europeans will acquire critical enablers, the things that they need to be more defense independent of the United States, to figure out the nuclear piece, to figure out command, that the United States being necessarily the supreme allied commander.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to take time, but we need to figure out what moves we're intent on making, with or without European cooperation, but then invite them to be part of a dialogue so that we don't have deterrence gaps if the United States is pulling back, and potentially also the war in Ukraine. I've also written a little bit about Taiwan strategy, where I think the United States needs to be very careful about getting into a no-kidding war with China over this issue. A lot of the cross-strait dynamics are not ones that are under American control. They're about what the Taiwans do and what Beijing does. But I think we need to work with them to push them, first of all, to continue their advancements in establishing a denial-based defense, and work on how the United States could assist Taiwan in the event of a military contingency, without necessarily being fully involved in that conflict. So those are just some of the areas of middle. We haven't even talked about the Middle East, and there's a lot to say there too.
Let's dig into the Middle East a little bit. It strikes me that for decades and decades, the United States' relationship with Israel was seen as a critical ally in the region. As you talk to younger people, they may not be as all in with Israel as their parents and or grandparents. Should Israel be worried about relations with the United States going forward?
Absolutely. There's been a generational paradigm shift. It's on the right, it's on the left, so it is generational more than it is partisan. We're seeing it right now, and it's happened more quickly than one might have thought a few years ago. Israel should be worried, and it is worried, I think. And ironically, that may be one contributing factor to the decision to attack Iran, insofar as Iran was in a particularly vulnerable position, but also one had to ask, will the political conditions be there in the United States in the future if that card could be played again? So ironically, the diminution in public support for Israel, particularly among younger Americans, may be kind of accelerating American support for Israel in the short term, but that probably will also contribute to a further diminution of American support for Israel. So, I'm not going to advise the Israeli government as to what their interests are, but I do think for the United States, our lockstep over-identification with the interests of the Israeli government comes at a serious risk to American interests globally, to our own domestic life. Look at what's happened on our college campuses. So, we need to, at a minimum, I think, be phasing out. The idea that the United States should be giving taxpayer gifts to Israel year after year doesn't make any sense. I don't think it's going to make any sense to people under 40, basically. So at a minimum, that needs to be phased out, and we need to, at a minimum, treat Israel like we treat other allies, where in fact our arms sales are conditioned on all kinds of things.
Want to respond on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with much of what you've just said. I guess, to me, that's one question in the Middle East. The other is Iran itself and the investment that we are now making with essentially the forefront of our military is now once again deployed in the Middle East. It's deja vu all over again. And I guess I would again sort of make a more philosophical point. I think the implicit strategy in the Biden administration was to recognize there were three theaters. There was Europe, there was the Middle East, and there was East Asia. And that as you make a strategy, you have to think, what is the relationship among those theaters? I think, again, implicit in the Biden administration strategy was to lean into the European theater because it was the location of our closest allies, because it was the where Russia had violated international norms, international law most blatantly. And it was a place where by pushing back, you could, in a sense, buttress a sense of order and a recommitment to a certain set of principles most effectively. So lean into Europe, not disengage, let me rephrase that, but try to, in a sense, avoid further entanglements in the Middle East, because that was not an area either where we were likely to make enormous progress or where our interests were most profound. And then to build positions of strength with respect to East Asia at the same time that we set guardrails to prevent competition from turning into something much more damaging to the United States, to China, and to global order. What's fascinating to me is that the Trump administration has inverted that completely. It has sought an entanglement in the Middle East. It has pulled out from Europe, the theater, not pulled out, but diminished its investment in Europe, the theater in which success was the most likely, and is now pursuing a position with respect to China that I think actually erodes those positions of strength. So again, I think this is the strategic challenge. To me, the question of U.S. support for Israel is a fundamental one, but it actually is subordinate to this larger.
Can I just say I fully agree with all that? I do think it's worth noting, though, that the Biden administration rightly tried to deprioritize security in the Middle East. In fact, initially, it also tried to deprioritize Europe, seeking a stable and predictable relationship with Russia. And I think what this shows, given the events that have transpired, is that when the United States leaves itself thoroughly entangled in the security arrangements of a region, and then says, "Oh, but it'd be convenient for us if everyone would just settle down and we could shift our focus somewhere else," that's not the way the world actually works. So if we, in fact, want to have more strategic focus, we do need to pull back from the places that we think matter less.
With our remaining time, gentlemen, I'd like to, before we bring our closer in, Mark, with our remaining
Here's the
time,
play-by-play from you.
I would like to dig in on AI. How does AI potentially shake up the world order? Who the heck's going to regulate it? You touched on the possibility of sitting down with the Chinese at some point. And how does that, I don't know, just how does it change our world? How do you see it changing our world in the short term and beyond?
I mean, I struggle just to get Gemini to tell me what sources it's using. That's kind of where I am on AI. So I don't presume to have any kind of an answer to what you say. I like Alex's formulation that, frankly, we don't know, right? There are a lot of big claims. This is extremely difficult to predict. When I thought about the prompt and the world of 2029, one of the things I didn't address in my memo was AI, because I think we're going to have a lot more information in the coming years about the kinds of, first of all, what the technology can do, and secondly, how it affects our societies, our economies, et cetera. So I think that's something that will be a little bit better able to assess. But I do think ultimately we're in a place right now of basically no government regulation of AI internationally or United States domestically. That can't be the answer at the end of the day. So we are going to have to it gives us a stronger incentive, I think, to be able to sit down with China and find some kind of rules of the road. And that in turn does mean that we need to think about the extent to which we want to be cutthroat in our competition with China across a whole host of domains.
The two parties in Congress cannot agree on basic aspects of life. So I'm not expecting Congress to come up with profound legislation on artificial intelligence. I think there are some people there who are very interested in the issue and engaging on it, but we've seen some states try to do some regulation. You touched on the possibility of sitting down with China, but do other countries need to potentially be at the table? Need to be a global summit on artificial intelligence? And then, I guess, who officiates if somebody violates principles?
Yeah, huge question, and one to which I don't think there's a totally satisfactory answer. I just want to say, this is an area where I think all of us require a little more humility. Myself, because I'm a neophyte in this question, as a number of people in the national security world are. There's a kind of cacophony of ill-informed views that are beginning to take up a lot of space. So I don't want to add to that on the technical side.
Sure.
But I think to answer your question, there are a number of states that are part of this equation, and many of them are aligned with us. And I think that's a fundamental one. The precursor chemicals that make the semiconductors come from Japan. The semiconductors are produced in Taiwan. The Netherlands has advanced capabilities as well, to say nothing of South Korea and others. This is, not only is it a kind of global question, but it's a question where actually we have a lot of advantages in the way that conversation would take. I do think, as we think about the effects of AI broadly, that is a conversation which many, many states will need to participate. The reason that I focused on the United States and China is there's an enormous gap between the two of us and every other state around the world in terms of the frontier. And the frontier is what worries me the most. I won't paint the apocalyptic scenarios that everyone else can do better, but I think it is profoundly in our interest and in China's interest to sit down and begin thinking about those scenarios and thinking about what steps we can each take that would protect us from some of those worst outcomes. The last thing I'll say, and as I read the literature that's coming out, this kind of cacophony I've described on the relationship between AI and geopolitics, what worries me most is while private companies in the United States will invest in the frontier, this is not like nuclear weapons, this is not a Manhattan Project, this is driven by the private sector. That, I think, will remain the case for the foreseeable. The process of driving development in AI into the way that we conduct our economy and deliver public services as a government, that's going to require government spending. That is the industrial policy which creates incentives for companies and institutions to adopt these techniques and actually make them part of our everyday life. That's something the Chinese are doing extremely effectively, and we're doing basically not at all. That's an area where I think this investment is going to be required. The problem is if you ask Americans, how do you feel about a future of AI? The answer is profoundly negative. I think it's around 35%, whereas in China it's over 80%. See this as a positive development, and that helps the Chinese government sustain the domestic political coalition for that spending. So I'm standing here, or sitting here, saying I think we need to invest at a moment where the American public is concerned about data centers and the expense that this will add to their energy bills. They're concerned about their children's education. They're concerned about their job. And so we need to have a much more robust conversation domestically about what the future of AI should look like in America. If we don't have that conversation, the ability to sustain the public spending that will give us a competitive edge over time will evaporate. That's my biggest concern, and I think that's a conversation which, to be honest, really hasn't started.
Does the United States need to win the AI race? Not.
I think I'm a hedger.
Within your area of expertise.
Yeah. So, look, I'm a hedger. I believe. Let me take it back to something we've talked about already: AI safety. China doesn't want to talk to us about AI safety, and there are a number of different reasons for that. They also don't want to talk to us about their nuclear program and weapons reduction. I think probably for some very similar reasons. And so I don't want to go to the Chinese and say we'd really love to have these conversations from a position of weakness.
Right.
I think the only way those conversations are going to succeed is if we are at the frontier and there are capabilities that we have which put the Chinese at risk. Not because I want to exercise those capabilities, but because I want the Chinese to talk to us about them. I think that requires us to remain.
Artificial intelligence.
I think we should remain at the frontier, yeah, for all the reasons Alex said. But we also have to think about what does it mean to win the AI race. I think Americans are more interested in the framing of winning than the Chinese are. Their focus seems to be on applying AI in society. So, as Alex said very eloquently, we need to be able to use the technology that we create in a way that fosters cohesion in the United States rather than continues to tear us apart.
All right, closer. Mara,
On that point, well, I have to say,
your thoughts.
I've been sitting here feeling reminded of when I took the LSAT exams, which was quite a long time ago. I don't know how many people are familiar with that or the logic section, but my logic puzzle has been, how can I agree with so much of what Alex has said and disagree with so much of what Stephen has said when they both are saying they agree with each other so much. So I'm gonna try to go into that. I think one common point that I actually share with everyone is that the primary responsibility of a United States leader is ensuring the security and ideally shared prosperity across the country. Across the United States. I think that's the responsibility of most leaders in the world, but within the United States, the structure we have to do that. I actually don't think it's helpful to think in terms of domestic policy and foreign policy, nor do I begin to understand how a reductionist approach, which feels very dated for the world that we're in, actually accomplishes the aims of security and prosperity for the American people. And so I'd go to Alex's 4 fundamentals, because I think there's a key part of looking at industrial strategy. I don't know that we've done it particularly effectively as a country, either definitely concerned about some aspects of President Biden's approach, very concerned about some aspects of President Trump's approach, because I don't think government makes great investment choices in the business side, so figuring out how the private sector and public sector can work together. But I think we have real opportunities there. Those opportunities necessarily cannot stay within our borders. So the idea that in the world that we live in today, because the United States is an island nation, which I've heard naval leaders talk about, we have a lot of water around us, as you pointed out, that we can get everything done even by staying within our hemisphere to ensure the prosperity and security of the American people. I just think is an astonishingly dated vision. And I think we see that regardless of what folks feel about why we went into Iran or didn't go into Iran, or should or should not have gone in, the impact for this country economically and in security terms, because a fundamental role of the United States has been ensuring free shipping pathways throughout the world. And that is necessary for supply chains. It's necessary for our farmers. It's necessary for, getting helium, getting, fertilizer, a variety of different issues of countries being able to transit around the world and the freedom of commerce. And so I would go back, for example, let's take the point on technology and AI. And again, I'm in Alex's boat of I don't want to prognosticate on technology I don't understand, but what I do see is opportunities on things like data centers within the United States, where we right now, which is a key part of what you need for the AI industry as it is, and it takes up a huge amount of energy and a huge amount of water. And so you can see those as problems, or you can see those as opportunities. So if you, for example, and we right now have many more data centers than China does, and we have a number of different controls in place in various ways to try to ensure China can't get some of the stuff that we use in those data centers that slows down their ability to do that. But it's a race, and I would say, if you don't think China's concerned about winning, I'm curious about how much you've kind of talked to or dealt with Chinese leaders. In the same way, that the United States is concerned about winning. If you're competitive in the world and you want to make sure that you're securing the security and the economy of your country, you're going to look at where your biggest competitors are and how you can advantage. And by the way, that's not just by doing stuff in Asia to stop the competitor. The competitor, as I think Peter made the point last night, is looking all around the world to see how they can gain economically. And I think, again, economic and security terms are linked. So you have to do that as well. So coming back to data centers, there's actually tremendous opportunity to think like in terms of renewable energy and what we need to do in this country. It's not a partisan issue. You need that kind of energy. In fact, a lot of data centers in the United States are starting to build within their own parameters the ability to generate electricity through renewables. How do you use that to your advantage? How do you create the jobs that are long-lasting jobs at those places that come from those places? How do you look at education needs within the country? See what your competitors are doing, see where AI plays or doesn't play in that. And I think in general, there's a lot of reform we can do to our education system to increase the opportunity to create the good jobs in this country. All of that requires, though, working with others. In the same way that with any given community, it's rare that you can be strong enough if you're only depending on your family or you're only depending on your workplace. You need kind of a civic organization. You need people that you work with. You want other people on your team. It's going to make you ultimately a stronger family. It's going to give your kids more opportunities to come to UVA. And it's the same way when we work around the world. So allies may shift. You have allies and partnerships everywhere. That's just good business. It's good for your economy. It's good for your country. And it's part of the reason, and they haven't necessarily made the best decisions, but it's part of the reason we end up with presidents who say a bunch of things in the campaign trail, and then whether Democrat or Republican, end up fairly extended in the world. It's not because they don't care about the American people, it's because they do. And they're trying to figure out, however imperfectly, and I think there's been a lot of imperfection on it, how you increase the security and prosperity of your people, and that involves having relationships outside your country and inside your country to do that.
All right, thank you. So we have a distinguished circle of participants, UVA faculty, Miller Center fellows, who may come into the conversation now. We're going to pass a microphone, and if you'll do me a favor so the streaming audience knows exactly who you are, introduce yourself and ask your question.
Gil Copeland, Department of Politics, University of Virginia. It's a great panel, fantastic. I want to pick up on something that Mara was alluding to, which is, in some sense, it's the larger question here, why are we extended into the world? In other words, if both Democrats and Republicans find themselves getting involved in the Middle East, getting involved in East Asia, obviously in Europe as well, why? And in an ironic way, I want to push back with Stephen here. Stephen's written a great book called A World Transformed, which picks up on the idea that post-45 period was really the result of FDR setting up a series of bases and positions around the world to lock up about 2/3 of the world's economy. And Mel Leffler over here on my left also has talked about this as preponderance of power, economic power, that the US has had for 75 years. And it strikes me that that's the missing link here in the discussion. We have no real discussion over the economic struggle that's going on between China with its BRI, excuse me, and the US with its efforts to maintain its position. And notwithstanding Trump and the Western Hemisphere, I see the National Security Strategy Statement as saying, yes, we are still involved in East Asia, and a recognition there that the world economy depends upon the US. So I'm wondering what people think of this, that really, in a way, this desire to maintain US economy, the US economic edge over China, is really why we are so involved everywhere and why we can't escape that.
So I do think the conditions of American prosperity are bound up in the global economy and our relationship with China. I don't think that BRI is a good explanation for why the United States has the global military footprint and commitment that it has. Those predate the BRI's very existence. I think as the author of a book on World War II, I think what's really most striking to me about our current situation is actually the post-Cold War lineage. I think the reason why the United States took on so many, not only retained all of its Cold War alliances, but took on new defense, is essentially that the costs were low. We had a theory of primacy that said the United States could basically act like the global Leviathan. Others would bandwagon with the United States because they were attracted to us, but also because they were dissuaded by the scale of our power. And if that worked out, the United States could provide far-reaching global stability and security at a low cost to Americans. And I have no problem with that concept in theory. It just didn't work. It really didn't work because America was not that powerful relative to others, especially as you look on the ground in their own specific contexts, and because power does tend to make others uncomfortable and push back again. So I think that's kind of the situation that we're in. That doesn't mean we just retreat. And I really do want to respond to some of what Mara said, because, I mean, I want the United States to be the #1 military power. I want us to be engaged in Asia. I think I'm basically making a pivot to Asia argument.
That didn't help.
Okay, and it didn't work out because we did not actually draw down in a serious way from other places. So, that won't be easy to achieve for sure. But actually, I think it's much easier to achieve with respect to Europe than it has been for a while. The Middle East, very difficult, but we'll see. But obviously, a lot is changing there. But I want the United States to be engaged in international organizations on climate change, on technology, on nuclear weapons, on pandemics. I want the United States to be maybe not the leader of the free world, which I think is an outdated concept, but exercising constructive global leadership. But I think what is dated is to assume that the U.S. military presence is essential and is necessary to prevent some of the worst outcomes and doesn't cause problems of its own. The war in Iran is a great example. What caused Iran to do one of the very few things that can genuinely damage the permanent interest the United States has in the Middle East? Close down the Strait of Hormuz. A U.S. attack on Iran, right? An attack aimed at the survival of the regime, which gave it the incentive to close the strait. So we have to take that risk into at least our cost-benefit analysis when we think about whether it makes sense to maintain a military presence of about 40 to 50,000 troops in the Middle East, which is where it's been for a decade.
Your name was mentioned in the framing of that question. You want to respond?
Sure. I actually want to come back to something I was going to mention when I was talking about Alex's 4 points, which I think relates to this as well. I'm thinking quite a lot about the National Defense Strategy Commission on which I serve. We put out a report with recommendations, most of which have been ignored, in late summer of 2024. 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, appointed by the House and Senate. So again, it truly bipartisan effort and unanimous recommendations that called for increased spending for national security, and I'm going to describe what that is because I think it's key for getting done what you're suggesting, and also talked about the places where you get that money from. And again, agreement on it, but national security spending was everything from jobs training to the kinds of skilled workforce, the tradespeople that we need across the country, and how for the private sector that's part of public investment. It did not talk about a defense industrial base, it talked about our industrial base and what we need and the ways in which we need to interact with the world to do that. For example, changing some of our relationships so that South Korea ships can serve the U.S. Navy and also can serve other aspects of what the United States needs in private and public terms. So pretty dramatic changes, but you need to have a strong defense, whether or not you use it all of the time, to be able to have a backup for what you want to do economically and what you want to do in various ways. I think you have to recalculate how that budget works. You certainly should not be doing it, and you should not be talking about doing it at the expense of childcare, because, by the way, you also need childcare to get the job, to get people into your trades and skilled workforce. These things all interrelate. But suggesting, for example, that, and I think part of the problem the pivot to Asia also described last night, is China is looking out across the entire world. So the idea of the United States is just going to concentrate on what's happening in the Asia Pacific and put all of our military resources there is not going to actually protect us in the world or vis-a-vis China, because that's not what they're doing. And the interrelationship between economic and national security is profound. And I think that's being missed here. In the same way that if we want, and I want the Middle East to end up with a regional economic and security framework, and for the United States to be less involved. It's a little bit of a parallel to the NATO points that you and others have made. You don't get there by rolling up your carpet and going home and letting others just work it out. That's just not how things work in a practical way in the world to achieve the things that we may share interest in what you want to achieve. We profoundly disagree on how you get there.
Alex, and I definitely want to leave it open for a couple more questions. So, tightish answer.
I'll give a tightish answer first. It comes from Sigmund Freud, who talked about the tyranny of small. I think actually I agree with many things that Stephen has said, but there are important differences that are magnified in a conversation like that. But I think they are real, and a couple of them will come up as I answer the question without talking about it at all. I think there are three factors that are at play here. One is it's not just our economic relationship that keep us around the world, it's also extended deterrence. It's the nuclear umbrella which we have extended to our allies around the world, which means that the basis of our relationship with them and the decisions that they make are profoundly consequential for our security. And that is in the process of being renegotiated. I'm not eager for it to be renegotiated quickly, but I think it is being renegotiated. That will keep us in the rest of it. Number two is geography has become compressed. That is the story of globalization. Most obvious is cyber. So we have giant oceans, but cyber attacks don't care about water. And so there are ways in which we are vulnerable that space no longer helps to explain. I think that means that we have to think about space differently than. And the last point is, boy, it's hard to get out. And I worked on Afghanistan withdrawal. I worked on ISIS, explosion of ISIS in the Obama administration. I don't have two presidents who are more committed to leaving the Middle East on those specific questions than those two men. Obama campaigned on getting out of Iraq, did it. It ended up relatively short order, turning into a metastasizing terrorist threat, which consumed the last two administrations. ISIS was a difficult enough problem to deal with on its own, I think, effectively. But it also had these knock-on effects. Immigration in Europe, the rise of populists and nationalism in Europe and in the United States is partially a consequence of ISIS. Now, I'm not saying that or that even he made the wrong decision, I'm saying that it has consequences. And for President Biden, again, I think the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan was exactly the right one. I don't think it was executed as well as it could have been. I don't think Russia invaded Ukraine. I do think Biden's poll numbers went from 54%, never hit 45%. Politically, it was a disaster. And these are just the reality. So, yes, my argument here, I'm closer to Mara. I do think we should not think the Middle East is the center of our. But I think that transition has to be managed in such a way that you build the new architecture. In order to enable that. Agree on goal, but sequencing
All right, we're up against the clock. Next question, please.
Thanks. I'm Steve Mull. I'm Vice Provost for Global Affairs here at UVA. 40 years ago, Ronald Reagan used to say America was a shining city on a hill, and that really powered so much of American soft power, which many people thought, including myself, were an essential component of our security and our prosperity. Well, 40 years later, the American image isn't so shiny anymore, and I was really struck by all of the panelists. There was no mention of soft power, of American values. What are American values, and do they matter anymore?
I mean, I think we as a country are trying to determine what American values are in the 21st century. I don't think we're in a very good position to be, telling other people that we know what they should be doing when we are so divided ourselves. But I do think soft power actually does matter. And I want to focus on healing our domestic divisions, moving our politics into a new place. And I do think foreign policy bears on that challenge because I think it can do things to further divide us and make a lot of Americans suspect that political authorities are not looking out for their interests. So, restoring programs, soft power programs, okay, we can talk about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I don't think a whole lot of that matters until we as a country solve our own problem.
Quick response?
I think I'd only say that I think the words have been ringing hollow in ways that are deeply, deeply damaging to American credibility around the world. On the other hand, the model that the United States was founded on, the idea that a new society could be created, that people could transcend difference, that you could build new institutions which would bring broad prosperity, those ideas remain attractive to billions of people.
Madam Closer, final word?
I wouldn't use words like values and soft power. What I would do is say what we are capable of in terms of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief is both the right thing to do, and if you're in a community, again, you help out the people around you, and it's like doing good by doing well. You can actually gain stuff by being in places, showing you can do that can be there, make a difference, and then in addition to that, using tools like the Reformed Development Finance Corporation, which President Trump deserves credit, I think, for how they've moved forward. There's congressional legislation that actually was enacted, again, bipartisan, to do that. A supercharged development finance corporation that can offer good deals internationally and then surround that with the kinds of other things that a USAID used to do, but helping in terms of energy needs and development, helping in terms of job creation or job training for what you want, for what the country you're going into wants to do. Those are things that will accrue to the United States benefit and are also doing well, do good in the country that you're in. But it's a rethought approach to how you use direct bilateral international assistance.
All right, I don't have a producer screaming in my ear, rap, 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 but I know we're up against, do we have time for one more?
I did. I was just actually curious what your perspective was on Trump's China policy.
It's a very difficult question to answer. I have heard from some people, actually, there's an extremely coherent policy that is managed by a small number of people and which aims to get a trade deal that benefits the American people, which diminishes areas of friction between the United States and China, and that we will see the fruits of shortly. That's not what I watch as I see American diplomats speaking, as I see the machinery of government acting. So it's very difficult to answer that. I'm not sure what the president.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that the only clear thing I see coming from this president is a tone of less hostility toward China most of the time than we've had from his first administration and in the Biden year. And that is interesting because I think a lot of observers in Washington assumed that we were heading toward a new Cold War type of competition with China, that this was the issue that resonated with the American public. Some even wrote that strategic competition would be something that can bring the country together. After all, you look at Congress, it is something that you get a lot of R's and D's voting on. And yet, President Trump doesn't seem to have been punished for speaking in a more respectful way toward Xi Jinping or about the desire to coexist with China.
Big hug.
So
Yeah.
big hugs. I mean, he varies a lot, okay? But I would say the sort of median of where Trump has landed is in a kind of coexistence relationship, which in its own way the Biden administration also agreed with. So that just tells us something about our own domestic politics. You also see in opinion surveys, fewer Americans are saying that China is an adversary as opposed to a competitor. The number who say adversary is down to about 1/3. So there does seem to be more space in our domestic politics for a more coexistence-minded or even constructive relationship with China than one might have assumed prior to Trump's second term.
Would you like a final word before they turn off the lights on us?
Sure, I'll be fast. I don't know what his China policy or strategy is. My biggest concern is I think he sees a world in which he is in a club with Xi and with Putin, and then everyone else circles around that. I think he thinks he's the alpha dog in that club. Not sure, given who's negotiating right now for end of the conflict in Iran. But so that's my concern about it. Who's in and who's out in his circle.
My thanks to Alex, Mara, and Stephen. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day. Big day ahead.